Good afternoon and welcome. I'm Chris Whytock, Professor of Law and Acting Dean at the UC Irvine School of Law. And I'd like to thank all of you for joining us for the UCI Distinguished Lecture featuring Representative Jamie Raskin. Representative Raskin, we're very honored to welcome you today. A graduate of Harvard College and Harvard Law School, Congressman Raskin represents Maryland's 8th Congressional District in the US House of Representatives. He was sworn into his third term at the start of the 117th Congress on January 3rd, 2021. He is serving in his third term on the House Judiciary Committee, the Committee on Oversight and Reform, and the Committee on House Administration, and his second term on the Rules Committee and the Coronavirus Select Committee. He's also chair of the Oversight Subcommittee on Civil Rights and Civil Liberties and chair of the Rules Subcommittee on Expedited Procedures. Prior to his time in Congress, Representative Raskin was a 3-term state senator in Maryland, where he also served as the Senate Majority Whip. And some of you may also know that he was a professor of constitutional law at American University's Washington College of Law for more than 25 years. He's the author of several books, including Washington Post bestselling Overruling Democracy, The Supreme Court versus the American People, We the Students, Supreme Court Cases for and About America's Students, and most recently, Unthinkable, Trauma, Truth, and the Trials of American Democracy. Today's event will be moderated by Professor Rick Hasen, Chancellor's Professor of Law and Political Science at the University of California, Irvine, and co-director of the Fair Election and Speech Center. And as many of you know, Professor Hasen is a nationally recognized expert in election law and campaign finance regulation. Representative Raskin, welcome again. Thank you so much for joining us today, and the floor is yours.
Christopher, thank you so much. What a delight and what an honor it is to be invited to appear with you and to join the distinguished faculty out there at UCI for this event, and your great student body and the alumni. And I do look forward to a return engagement sometime when I actually get to come out there and hang out with everybody. I'm actually reaching you today, not from Maryland or even from Washington, but from Newark, Delaware, where I have also been visiting the Biden Center at the University of Delaware and addressing the students here. But I've been very much looking forward to this. And I thought I would just talk for 10 or 15 minutes about the general themes of my little lecture here, and then we'll open it up to questions. And I look forward to having dialogue with my friend, Professor Rick Hasen. So the title of my talk is Constitutional Patriotism, the Failures of Partisanship and the Future of American Democracy. I start with constitutional patriotism because I think that's the value that is in scarce supply today, and it's the one that we are going to need most to get us through the current crisis. The phrase I borrow from the German philosopher Habermas, Jürgen Habermas, who articulated a theory of constitutional patriotism in the wake of Nazism in World War II. And it connoted for him a belief in the political institutions and the constitutional processes of the society as the central organizing principle, as opposed to something else like race or militarism or blood and soil and some of the darker, atavistic, primitive impulses, which he saw as dangerous based on the experience of Germany and other countries with the authoritarian and totalitarian movements and governments of the last century. So constitutional patriotism today, in our context, means to me elevating your belief, your loyalty, and your allegiance to the Constitution as a whole and the nation which the Constitution binds together over your political party, over your specific ideology, over any other agenda. So trying to maintain adherence to the whole constitutional regime. We are a nation unified not by one race or one ethnicity or one religion or one ideological system or one theology, but we are a nation unified by virtue of one constitution and the rule of law and the processes under the Constitution, the values that underlie it. And this is why, for me, the example set by Vice President Mike Pence on January the 6th, maintaining his oath of office, maintaining his loyalty to the Constitution when he was being urged to abandon and desert his constitutional role and to declare and enunciate heretofore unknown extra constitutional powers in the vice president to void electoral college votes, to reject certificates of ascertainment coming in from the governors from the states. His determination to stick with the rule of law made him a real constitutional patriot on that day. And I would use the same appellation for everybody who voted to impeach Donald Trump for inciting violent insurrection against the Union, and especially those 10 Republicans who did that, who broke party lines in order to state what seemed obvious, I think, to a majority of people in the House, that then President Trump had incited an insurrection against the Union, which ended up storming our body. And that insurrection, of course, led to the injury, the wounding of 150 of our officers, who ended up with broken jaws and necks and arms and legs and ribs and traumatic brain injuries, post-traumatic stress syndrome, you name it. It was an absolute nightmare that we witnessed on that day. So these people, the Republicans who have been most outspoken on the House side, on the Senate side, including the 7 who voted to convict, Liz Cheney, Adam Kinzinger, these people have demonstrated to the country what it means to be a constitutional patriot, to elevate your fidelity to the rule of law, to our constitutional system and values, over a party agenda, over loyalty to any one individual. And this, I think, is going to be the spirit that gets us through a very dangerous moment in American history, when our institutions, our processes are being called into question, when tens of millions of people are following a leader who is challenging the results of an election that has been certified not just by all 50 states, not just by the House and the Senate, but also by 60 plus federal and state courts, which have rejected every claim of electoral fraud or electoral corruption. Okay, so constitutional patriotism is the value that we need, and yet we are locked in to a partisan paradigm. So I want to say some things about political parties and our Constitution, and both the successes and the failures of partisanship in America today. Now, our Constitution, as Richard Hofstadter wrote, was written basically against political parties. If you go back and you read Madison's famous Federalist Number 10, it was all deploring faction and what factions do to the public interest, the res publica, the public thing. And for Madison and the framers, everything was about instilling Republican virtue and a commitment to the national public interest and the national common good over sectarian, petty, or self-interested party agendas, partisan agendas. Now, the Constitution doesn't mention political parties, much less a two-party system, much less two specific parties. All of these things have grown up afterwards. And yet the framers, like all of us probably, were a bit schizophrenic about parties. While they deplored the spirit of party, Thomas Jefferson, for example, made it a point after the very heavily contested presidential election between him and Adams in 1800, he made a point of saying at his first inaugural address, "We are all Republicans, we are all Federalists." And he also said, if I could only go to heaven with a political party, then I would prefer not to go at all. Okay, and so there was a kind of high-mindedness about distancing yourself from political parties and partisanship. At the same time, they were all deeply engaged and ensconced in party politics, and none more so than Jefferson himself, who was a great partisan schemer and organizer and orchestrator of events. And so I think we all live that kind of Jeffersonian paradox. We understand parties can be dangerous at the same time we are caught up within them. And I think it's worth focusing on why we are caught up in political parties and where that comes from. And that was something also that the framers understood really well. You get a group of human beings together, not just Americans, but any human beings anywhere, into a House of Representatives, a Senate, a school board, a faculty meeting, a student council, a bowling club. People are almost inevitably going to be forming themselves into groups and fighting about something and debating about something. This is almost ineradicable in human nature. And the groups and the schisms and the conflicts will split, as we've seen in the history of religion. They will shift over time, that is, they will mutate and change, but the constant does seem to be partisan with a small p, partisan division and sectionalism and competition. Okay, so that's built into human nature and people disagree. At the political level, there's an easy way to get rid of partisanship, and people are always deploring partisanship. You get rid of political parties. You move to a one-party state. A one-party state doesn't have many problems with partisanship. So if we move to a one-party dictatorship or a monarchy, then we're not going to have a problem with partisanship. In that sense, you can see partisan debate, partisan conflict and dialogue and discussion as a healthy thing. It's an expression of the First Amendment, the fact that people have freedom of speech, freedom of press, freedom of assembly, freedom to associate, freedom to organize, and so on. And I would go even further to say some affirmatively positive things about political parties. Political parties articulate issues, they articulate policy agendas, they clarify conflicts and choices for the public. They provide a clue to voters. You go into organize the government and form caucuses to develop agendas to press forward. So I would say 2 cheers for political parties in that sense. But, and here's the thing, and here I speak as a public official, as a member of Congress, I do believe that while it's a good thing for the parties to fight it out like cats and dogs in the elections, once we are elected, each one of us who aspires and attains to public office has got to remember that the word party comes from the French word parti, a part. Each party is just a part of the whole. And when we're elected, we have to try to speak for and legislate for and serve the whole of the people and not just the people who got us elected. And that's what creates a lot of cognitive dissonance, because on the one hand, you owe your election, both past and future, to this group of people who are your party, except in your public office, you owe your allegiance and your fiduciary duty and your service to everybody. We know how to be perfectly nonpartisan when we want to be. If you come to my district office in Rockville, Maryland, as I hope you do, certainly if you're a resident of Maryland's 8th Congressional District, and you've got a problem with Social Security or Medicare or your PPP loans or your VA benefits, whatever it is, we will go to bat for you. The only question we ask is, do you live in the 8th Congressional District? Because under the rules of the House, we're only allowed to serve constituents who are actually our constituents who live in my district. We don't ask, are you a Democrat, a Republican, a Libertarian, a Green, or an Independent? That would be ridiculous. So we know how to take off our partisan caps when we want to. And my great disappointment about the impeachment process and the trial in the Senate was how many senators prejudged the trial and the verdict in the trial. They were saying before the trial started, during the trial, that Trump should be acquitted for this reason or that reason. And conversely, there were people on the other side who were saying Trump was guilty, and they were going to convict him even before the evidence was heard. Neither of those was the right approach to the trial. They were sworn to render impartial service and an impartial verdict in the case. And one of my regrets from the trial is that I had a motion, which I decided not to go through with on the advice of some of the Senate leadership, which would have changed the seating arrangements in the Senate, because right now the senators sit the way we sit in the House. The Republicans are seated to the right of the president pro tem or the president of the Senate, looking out on the chamber. The Democrats are seated to the left. But I said, whoever heard of a jury sitting according to political party registration and designation? Juries sit randomly, and the senators sitting as a jury, and there, of course, that's a bit of an oversimplification because they're jurors, but they're also judges because they're also deciding on questions of law, like evidence and so on. But in any event, they're basically a jury. Whoever heard of a jury sitting according to a political party, and they should be seated instead alphabetically or completely randomly. I do regret that I didn't press that point further. I'm not saying it would necessarily have altered the outcome, but as I learned back in Introduction to American Government when I was in college, where you sit is where you stand. And party leaders in parliaments all over the world love to have the members from their party seated together so that they can get the word out quickly. They can have people reinforcing each other's commitment to a party dictated outcome and so on. And we should not have had that. We really should have opened it up. We also should possibly have had a secret ballot rather than an open ballot. I know that that would have been very difficult to convince the senators of. The first one was difficult because they said the senators are very committed to their desks and where they're seated, and their desks had just been rifled by the insurrectionists and their personal belongings had been stolen or removed or tampered with or vandalized. And so they were already feeling kind of a little bit nervous and uptight about that. In any event, the point I'm making is that partisanship should have had nothing to do with it. Nobody should have been voting according to political party, much less according to the will of one person or fear of one person. And that was the argument really for moving to a secret ballot, that there were people who were afraid either of violent threats, because there were still a lot of violent threats in the air. Most of the insurrectionists had left the Capitol without ever being arrested. They were still out there. And on a lot of the domestic violent extremist websites, they were calling for a return engagement on Inauguration Day to prevent Joe Biden from even being sworn in. So there was a lot of fear there. And there was also fear of political retaliation and political revenge being exacted by the former president. So the framers predicted that those of us in Congress would end up identifying institutionally with the interests of our House, the House of Representatives or the Senate. They thought when there would be a competition of different groups within the government, it would be identified by the institutional branch. That tendency has been overcome by political party cohesion and membership and allegiance. People are far more connected and committed to the success of their party than they are to the success of their particular legislative institution or the executive branch or the judicial branch. And so that's something I'm not sure the framers anticipated, and it's a very serious problem for us. The trial that we conducted in the Senate was the fourth presidential impeachment trial in the US Senate in American history. The first was Andrew Johnson, the second was Bill Clinton's, and the third and the fourth were Trump 1 and Trump 2. That's it. We've never had a president convicted in the Senate. In fact, the result in the second impeachment trial, the one where I was the lead impeachment manager, was the most sweeping bipartisan result in the history of the United States in an impeachment trial. And we had all 50 Democrats vote to convict. We had 7 Republicans from all over the country, New England, the Mid-Atlantic, the Midwest, the South, the West, Alaska, voting to convict. But that 57-43 result was not enough. It's a pretty robust majority verdict that Joe Biden was president and Donald Trump had engaged in an insurrection based on his big lie, but it was not enough to convict, Donald Trump under the 2/3 requirement. So people have asked me whether we need to alter the 2/3 requirement in a presidential impeachment trial. I don't know the answer to that. I haven't really thought that through systematically. But that is an academic question, because I don't think that there would be 2/3 of the House and the Senate and 3/4 of the states getting behind that idea. But I don't think that the difficulty of getting to 2/3, even under a very polarized partisan environment, means that impeachment and impeachment trials are futile or useless under our system. We were able to bring to light the fact that Donald Trump had incited a violent insurrection. I think we convicted him in the court of public opinion. We convicted him, I think, in the eyes of history, and we laid the groundwork for the select committee on the January 6th attacks to do its work on the far broader question, not of what one person did with respect to one offense, but how did all of these events come about? What were the causes behind them? And what do we need to do to fortify our democratic institutions going forward? So let me just close on that note. The future of American democracy has not been written. The future of democracy has not been written. And as we see in what's taking place today with Russia and Ukraine, democracy is really under siege all around the world. The authoritarian and autocratic governments are on the march, whether it's Putin in Russia or Orban in Hungary or Bolsonaro in Brazil or Duterte in the Philippines or al-Sisi in Egypt or the Trumpist authoritarian movement in the United States still attacking our constitutional structure. Wherever it is, these authoritarian movements have been unleashed. And so a lot of the monsters of the 20th century that we thought we had put to bed, like racism and white supremacy and authoritarianism and anti-Semitism, are back again. And so we need to defend American constitutional democracy through acts of constitutional patriotism by people all across the political spectrum. And we need to update democracy and keep it growing. Tocqueville said in Democracy in America that voting rights and democracy in our country are always either shrinking and shriveling away, or they're growing and expanding. And we've been in very much of a contractionary mode, where voting rights have been under attack, where democracy's been under attack by a lot of anti-democratic instruments, like the gerrymandering of our congressional and state legislative districts, like the use of the filibuster to block voting rights legislation, like the passage of voter suppression statutes all over the country to roll back early voting, to roll back weekend voting, to roll back mail-in balloting, to impose, as Professor Hasen has written a lot about, partisan election administration, to replace nonpartisan or bipartisan election administration with party-controlled elections, with party-controlled state legislatures or governors as the backup in the case of a real electoral crisis. That is dangerous. So we need to keep democracy moving. We've got to get out of the contractionary mode and get into the growth mode. And that means We have to get moving in terms of statehood. We have in Washington, D.C., my next door neighbors, the only residents of a national capital on earth who are disenfranchised in their own national parliament, 713,000 tax-paying, draftable American citizens who have no vote in the House or the Senate on everything from federal budgets to Supreme Court nominations to declaration of war to finally their own system of governance, because the District of Columbia's laws ultimately are all subject to what Congress does. We got 3.5 million people in Puerto Rico who are left out, 3.5 million American citizens who learned the bitter price of colonial disenfranchisement in Hurricane Maria, where they were cheated out of hundreds of millions of dollars of desperately needed hurricane aid. But generally speaking, we need to pass national legislation to guarantee the right to vote. We really need a constitutional amendment on the right to vote, but I understand that's further off. But we need the John Lewis Voting Rights Act. We need the Freedom to Vote Act that we ended up with in the Senate after we began with the For the People Act in the House. We need to get back on the growth path for American democracy. And that means we need acts of constitutional patriotism across the political spectrum from everyone standing up for the basic ideals of our government that were latent in what Jefferson put into the Declaration of Independence: the consent of the governed, the unalienable rights of the people, life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness for everyone. And then all of the changes we've gone through since then to make us a more perfect union. You can read the amendments that we've had since the Bill of Rights, the 17 amendments, as the chronicle of the democratizing struggles of the people. The 13th Amendment abolishes slavery. The 14th Amendment gives us equal protection and due process. The 15th Amendment bans race discrimination in voting. The 17th Amendment shifts the mode of election of US senators from state legislatures to the people of the states. The 19th Amendment doubles the electorate with women's suffrage. The 23rd Amendment gave people in DC the right to participate in presidential elections. The 24th Amendment ends poll taxes. The 26th Amendment lowers the voting age to 18. The whole trajectory of our constitutional development has been for greater democratic inclusion. And you can look at the struggle that we're having in America today as a contest between continuing democratic growth and enlargement and the will of the majority against this bag of tricks like the filibuster and the gerrymander and the voter suppression tactics. So that's the struggle that we need young America to be engaged in. And that's why I'm so happy to be here today with you, Professor Hasen, and with the dean and with the faculty. So thank you very much for having me.
Well, thank you, Representative Raskin, for those very thoughtful remarks. You know, when I read your book, Unthinkable, I see you as a legislator and a leader there, and as a father, because it's a deeply personal story you tell there. But your remarks today remind us that before all of that, you were a scholar and a teacher. And it's good to be back with you in that context as well. Just a reminder that if you do have questions, you can use the Q&A function. I already have 17 questions. I won't be able to get to all of them, but feel free to keep adding to them. I was actually going to open up with a question about the Ukraine crisis, but you've hit on that. So let me, because I think we something that we can't ignore, the movement globally around the world. But let me start with pivoting off of your remark earlier when you were mentioning you don't know if the impeachment rules could be changed because it would require the overcoming the hurdles for a constitutional amendment. I want to ask you about what is doable today. And so you mentioned the Freedom to Vote Act and the For the People Act and the John Lewis Act. Pretty much no Republican support for any of those, I think, except maybe the John Lewis Act had Lisa Murkowski express some support. But there is now talks among 16 senators, some Republicans, some Democrats, about anti-election subversion legislation, changing the Electoral Count Act. What's your view on how good this legislation might be, how doable it is, and how much it could prevent the next crisis of American democracy where we are worrying about peaceful transitions of power?
Well, thank you for your kind remarks, Professor Hasen. Well, let's start with the Electoral Count Act. You know, the Electoral Count Act, as we know, is a Byzantine and, you know, in some places incomprehensible and inscrutable statute. So there's no doubt that, you know, it could use a tune-up in a lot of different ways. One of the things we're talking about is moving the basis for objecting to a state's electoral college votes from one member in the House and one member of the Senate objecting to something like 25 or 50, so that theoretically it would create more deliberation around it and more seriousness to doing it. And that's something that we could have done a long time ago. We should do. I don't hold out a lot of hope that that's some kind of major breakthrough. I mean, if you look at the situation today, or on January 6, 2021, they would have had no problem hitting a threshold of 25, 50, even 75 or 100 in the House. Maybe, I don't know what the numbers are we're talking about in the Senate. It might have been, you know, somewhat more difficult, but I suppose that makes some sense. Another thing that is being bandied about is, let's articulate that the role of the vice president is a purely ministerial and managerial one, to oversee the hearing, kind of like the Chief Justice of the United States in a Senate impeachment trial of a president. You're not there to decide things yourself unilaterally. You're there to oversee the proceedings. That too strikes me as fine. I've got no particular problem with it. The only thing is, one, I don't want anyone to think that this is any kind of solution to the authoritarianism that bedevils us at every level of government. You know, it's infinitesimally small significance compared to like passing the Freedom to Vote Act or the For the People Act, where we actually guarantee people's right to vote. I just don't think it's that important. And the other thing is, I don't want, you know, President Trump, former President Trump, was already out there saying, well, we know that Mike Pence had the power to overthrow the election and nullify those electors and, you know, basically overcome Joe Biden's 7 million vote victory, his 306 to 232 victory in the Electoral College. We know he had that. And the reason we know that, he says, is because they're talking about amending the Electoral Count Act to clarify the vice president's role. And so, you know, that's obviously cynical and sinister, but that will be said. And here's the thing, we don't want to be fighting the last battle. The last battle was what happened on January 6th. The next battles are going to be voter suppression, the seizure of the strategic machinery of voting, as Professor Hasen, you've written about so much, you know, the continuing gerrymandering of the election in a very sinister and anti-democratic way. These are the problems we've got to face. And I would just hate for anybody to say, oh, I voted to change the number of people it takes to object to an electoral college slate, so we've dealt with January 6th. We haven't begun to deal with it. If we do something like that, there's far more sweeping reforms that are needed within the electoral process. And we've got to deal generally with the problem of authoritarianism and resurgent white nationalism in the country.
If I could just follow up on this point before we go on to something else. There's other proposals that are being talked about with this bipartisan group, including protecting election workers and election administrators, which I imagine should be non-controversial. But one of the, you know, talk about fighting the last war, you know, one of the questions on the next way that someone might try to subvert election outcomes is, you know, what should we be more worried about Congress, say a Kevin McCarthy-led Congress ignoring election votes, or should we be more worried about, say, a governor of a state sending in a wrong slate of electors, you know, the loser being declared the winner?
Yeah.
And one of the potential solutions that's been bandied about in terms of this Electoral Count Act reform is a role for the federal courts in adjudicating disputes over whether, a particular slate of electors that's sent in actually represents the choice of that state. Do you have a view, either a constitutional view or a pragmatic view, on whether a change like that would be desirable, necessary, constitutional?
Well, I don't know that we're going to have any kind of technical fix that will comprehensively or permanently address the problem of authoritarianism in our body politic, because authoritarianism, by its very nature, is willing to override the rules, whatever they are, or distort the rules. And you can have perverse unintended consequences. Say, for example, we say, well, if the GOP had been in control of the House, and if McConnell had been sufficiently cowed and intimidated by Donald Trump, they could have had narrow majorities upholding these attacks on perfectly valid results from Pennsylvania, Arizona, Georgia, Wisconsin, what have you. So people have said, well, why don't we say that rather than it taking a majority to uphold an objection to an electoral college slate from a state, you need 2/3. Oh, that sounds great. But then what happens if you reverse the hypothetical and you have a popular vote in Pennsylvania or Wisconsin, imagine in 2024, for Joe Biden, again, say he gets the same number of votes or more votes, and Donald Trump succeeds in convincing a GOP-controlled legislature to nullify the popular vote and just install a pro-Trump electoral college slate. Well, is it better then to make it more difficult to validate an objection in a situation like that? Or would we want it to be easier to validate an objection like that? Ultimately, I don't know that all of these electoral college brain teasers are solvable within the context of the current system. The very first bill I introduced as a state senator in Maryland, I think you know this, Rick, was for a national popular vote interstate compact to get us out of the electoral college system, which is flawed on so many levels. It's flawed because it's anti-democratic. I mean, why don't we elect the president the way we elect governors, US senators, mayors? Whoever gets the most votes wins. That's the way most people think we do it, or certainly think we should do it. But a lot of people walking around thinking that's how the president's elected, as opposed to this patchwork and vulnerable system. So that's number one. We've gotten 5 popular vote losers elected president of the Electoral College twice in this new century that we're in. So that's a real problem. Secondly, the Electoral College system, because it rewards swing states, which just means states in which there are relatively equal numbers of Democrats and Republicans, the whole general election comes down to 7 or 8 states, and we know what they are. Every high school kid knows what they are: Florida, Ohio, Michigan, and maybe 1 or 2 change. But basically, it's less than 10 states that become the entire battlefield and terrain of the election. Most of us live in totally safe blue states like California, your guys' state, or my state, Maryland, or totally safe red states like South Carolina or Alaska or Montana or what have you. And it doesn't correspond to size, by the way. 3 of the 4 largest states are safe states and are completely ignored in the general election. California, which is blue, New York, which is blue, Texas, which is red, and only Florida is something of a swing state, although it seems to be trending more red. So then we might instinctively think, because of our high school lessons on this, it favors the small states. No, we looked at the dozen smallest states. 11 out of the 12 smallest states are also safe states that are completely ignored in the election, like Rhode Island, which is blue, or Delaware, where I'm sitting right now, which is blue. Nobody campaigns in these states. I mean, I suppose Joe Biden might sleep here, when it comes to campaign. But there's no money spent. There's no offices set up. There's no TV ads. There's no campaigning. It's an irrational use of money. You spend it in Ohio, you spend it in Michigan, you spend it in Pennsylvania, and so on. But the final argument that I want to make is that in addition to escalating incentives for strategic mischief and corruption, now the Electoral College is, with the infusion of bad actors, is actually a forum for potential violence. It's like every phase of this complicated, obsolescent system has been transformed into another terrain of partisan conflict. So it used to be that the legislatures would just accept what the electors did. Now that's thrown up in the air. It used to be that the governors would just issue the certificate of ascertainment, where the secretaries of state would do it based on the certification of the vote. Now that's thrown up in the air. It used to be January 6th, my colleague in the Rules Committee, Ed Perlmutter, who's been in Congress a long time, told me that the first Wednesday of the first week of January after a presidential election used to be a day of bipartisan drinking and celebration. People would go to each other's offices and party or go out to the bars in DC. Now it's become an occasion for lethal violence. So I just don't think we can afford the Electoral College system anymore. Somebody who used to agree with me on that was Donald Trump, who said that the Electoral College made us the laughingstock of the world and was a joke and we needed to get rid of it and everything. And then he discovered new virtues to it after the 2016 election. But the National Popular Vote Compact, which is an agreement among states to cast their state's electors for the winner of the national popular vote, is a way to get out of this. It's a bridge to the future. Most constitutional amendments that have given us greater democracy started with state legislative action in the states. So if you look at the 17th Amendment about direct election of senators, before the Constitution was changed to accomplish that in 1913, a whole bunch of state legislatures said, we are going to be bound by the popular vote for US senators. We're going to get out of this business and we're going to say, we, the legislature, will just be bound by what the people have done. And so this is a pretty close analogy to that. It's saying, until we can get to a constitutionally established national popular vote, we'll be bound by what the people of the country say, and we'll operate our Article 2 power in accordance with the popular will.
So I think you'd probably agree with me that the chances of us getting a national popular vote by 2024 are quite small. The chances of getting the John Lewis bill through, quite small. The chances of getting For the People Act, quite small. There are, I'm up to 27 questions. I haven't asked any. So let me ask one that goes up across 5 or 6 of the questions, which is, what should people be doing in the next 3 years to assure that we continue to have a democracy that reflects the will of the people?
Well, I want to be respectful of the nonpartisan constraints of this format and context. So let me just say, I'll be as oblique as I can be, because I remember what it's like to be a law professor and trying to stay within that particular role. But look, I believe that we have one major party which is defending democracy today, and we have another party that has become a rule or ruin party, which basically takes the position that they will rule or they are going to ruin the prospects for social progress, as well as the prospects for democratic governance, because they're not going to accept the results of our elections. And I mean, this whole thing has been such a powerful lesson in the importance of political parties in a democracy accepting the election results. You could view that as the foremost primary obligation of a political party, or maybe the second one. The first is go out and campaign like hell to win, but if you win, you celebrate. If you lose, you accept the result and you move on to the next election. But if you don't, you're setting the society up for profound polarization and potentially for civil war or something like that. My party just lost a an election we really wanted to win in Virginia for governor, we didn't storm the Virginia state capitol. We didn't beat the daylights out of the Richmond police and the people who were defending the Virginia state capitol, and we didn't go around lying about it. We said, okay, we took a shellacking. What did we do wrong? Let's sit down, let's analyze it, and try to do better in the next election.
So
my answer is what people should do is you got to get involved in politics, and whether you're conservative, liberal, radical, libertarian, Democrat, Republican, Green, whatever it is, just be the best version of that you can be and infuse constitutional patriotism into your work.
So just following up on that, and this goes to some of the questions in the chat. You look at someone like Liz Cheney or Adam Kitzinger, they are under attack. And is it the job of Democrats? For example, in Wyoming, Democrats, at least as of now, unless they change the law, Democrats can cross over and vote for Liz Cheney in the primary, in the Republican primary. Should Democrats be doing that? There was an article in Politico this morning indicating that even though there are a number of Republicans who are running for office to be secretaries of state on the platform of the big lie, the false claim that the 2020 election was stolen, Democrats are not putting money, the large donor Democrats are not putting money into groups that are supporting Democrats who are fighting those claims in Secretary of State races. So what is the political activity to do to shore up the democracy, in more particular?
Well, I mean, again, I don't want to be too directive, as they say, in terms of what people choose to do. But one of the things I've learned in looking back at the history of coups and attempts at fascist takeovers against democracy is the left parties, the liberal and progressive parties, never can beat fascist coups on their own. They just don't. Even if they represent a majority of the people, they're generally not well organized enough, and they don't have enough of the social power. It's always the left parties together with the center-right parties. And so we need a broad coalition that's standing up for our electoral system, that's standing up for our constitutional framework. So I would urge everybody to get involved in all of the above things that you have suggested, whether it's at the Secretary of State level, at the State Attorney General level, whatever it is to protect our elections and the actual right of the people to vote. It seems to me there's an underlying tectonic shift going on here, and we should be open and honest about it. America is the greatest multiracial, multi-ethnic, multicultural, multi-religious democracy that's ever existed. And at some point in 20 or 30 years, the white population may become a minority in the country. It might be the largest minority, but it might be no longer the majority in the country. And that sense of shifting tectonics, I think, has created some of the grounds for what Donald Trump has done to the country. And so we have to have a reckoning about the assumptions of political white supremacy, and we've got to deal with everybody's anxieties and everybody's feelings about that. But we're fighting for, in my party, I feel comfortable, we're fighting for a party that's going to address the needs of the entire population. We're very excited about the infrastructure, the bipartisan infrastructure legislation that President Biden just led us on, more than $1 trillion into the roads and the highways and the transit systems, the ports and the airports, and cybersecurity and universal broadband, and you name it. That's something that's going to benefit the entire country. And I think that's the mentality we've got to have. What are those things that can promote universal benefits, universal rights for the whole population?
One thing that was conspicuously absent in your answer so far, I think, is the role of the courts. You briefly mentioned that the courts rejected Donald Trump's claims, tried to overturn the election. But when I asked you about the federal courts' role in potentially dealing with the Electoral College, you didn't respond directly to that. And I know I remember reading your book some years ago, can't remember the name of it, about the I think it was even the Rehnquist court's attack on voting rights. How much confidence should we have in the federal courts as protectors of voting rights and our rights more generally today?
Well, Rick, this is one reason that I'm no longer a law professor and I'm a member of Congress. I fell out of love with the Supreme Court a long time ago, as you're suggesting. I think, on naked lying, like what we've seen with Donald Trump and his supporters from 2020, the courts are going to do all right. There was simply no evidence for anything that they were saying. However, we have seen profound judicial activism from the right to overturn and undermine voting processes and democratic elections. And I'm afraid that there's a connection to what happened in Bush versus Gore to the kinds of things that are going on now. We've seen the Supreme Court totally rip to shreds the Voting Rights Act in Shelby County versus Holder and the Brnovich decision. But we've also seen, incredible judicial activism under the Constitution, like Shaw versus Reno and Miller versus Johnson, where the Supreme Court established an outrageous racial double standard, basically saying that legislatures cannot create bizarrely drawn majority African-American or Hispanic districts, but they can create bizarrely drawn majority white districts. That's just assumed to be the norm. So what I tell law students is the Supreme Court still has a little bit of a halo left over from the Warren Court era, from decisions like Brown versus Board and Roe versus Wade and Miranda versus Arizona. That was a very brief period in American history. For the vast majority of American history, the judiciary has been a very reactionary institution. And if you think about the period of slavery, for example, the Supreme Court did nothing to benefit, to help the most vulnerable people in society. On the contrary, it constantly sided with the slave masters and the slaveholders. And in the Dred Scott decision, declared that African Americans, descendants of slaves, had no rights that the white man was bound to respect, and that the Constitution was a white man's compact. And then even after the Civil War and the Reconstruction Amendments, the Supreme Court validated a brutal period of Jim Crow and lynching, again, undermined civil rights legislation. And in 1896, in Dred Scott, constitutionalized American apartheid in the Jim Crow system, which lasted all the way up until Brown v. Board, or I guess maybe you could call it the white primary cases, Terry versus Adams and Smith versus Allred. But basically, what I'm saying is that the liberal period of the Supreme Court that has given the court its positive reputation is totally anomalous in terms of its history. And the court has returned to the baselines of political white supremacy, conservatism about property and power, corporate power specifically. And that's just a reality. And that's why, I would say if and when I ever go back to a law school, I'm going to teach as much about what legislatures do and what citizens can do in law as what judges do and what courts do, because the Constitution belongs to everybody, and so does the rule of law.
Well, we're almost out of time. And so I'm going to end with a question that I think is an appropriate one that comes from an attendee. It says, "Thank you for your service to this country. How does one maintain optimism in the face of such rancor and uncivil political discourse that we face today?"
Well, it's a lovely question. I suppose the answer is built into the question. My dad used to say, when everything looks hopeless, you're the hope. And I wish I could be with the great students from Irvine right now, but I'll get to meet you guys at another point. But you really are the hope. I mean, this is a generation that is beyond the racism, beyond the misogyny, beyond the anti-Semitism, beyond the immigrant bashing. You know, you guys are, unfortunately, you're also a little bit beyond grammar, but that's it. We'll chew over that bone some other time. But your generation is needed in a really profound way to deal with the crises of America. And also, I know that you have very much on your minds climate change, as well as the creeping authoritarianism around us. And so I want you guys to feel the hope in the power of your generation, and you know, your music and your culture. And I do believe that generational politics will save us, because we're like in a total tie, in a complete stalemate in Washington right now. It's 50-50 in the Senate. We got a handful of votes in the, you know, the Democratic majority in the House because of the gerrymandered districts. Let's hope that we can hang on to that. But it's very tough to get anything done, and there are big things that we need to do. So I'm looking to your generation for the watershed change that we need.
Well, on those inspiring notes, let me thank you, Representative Jamie Raskin, for delivering today's UCI Law Distinguished Lecture. We appreciate your time, and we appreciate all of you who've joined us today.
Thank you so much for having me, Rick. And you do promise I'll be invited back in the flesh one day, right?
You have an open invitation.
All right. Thanks, everybody. Hang tough and stay strong for the battles ahead.
Thank you. Bye-bye.